evening and welcome once again to the Marty Heiser Show. We have got an incredible show for you tonight. Really, really incredible. I mean, sometimes you wonder how God works. And you know, you're flipping around the channel, there's no more NCAA basketball on. It's opening day, but the Mets had a day game and it didn't really matter. And here you are, you found this show, and tonight we have a real treat because we have the Reverend Dr. Clive Calver, who's the senior pastor at Walnut Hill Community Church, and he's going to be joining us, talking to us about all things eternal. He actually has a program at his church called Answers Over Easy, where he will take you to breakfast on a designated Friday morning, and you're allowed to ask any questions you possibly want. I remember at one of those breakfasts there was a firefighter, and that firefighter had seen a lot of death in his life. He had been a firefighter for many years in the city of Stamford, and his question for Clive was, he'd seen dead people. He'd taken dead people out of burning buildings, and he knew. And he really questioned whether there really was life after death. And Clive went to the Bible and talked about some of that. That same gentleman, that pastor, the senior pastor of Walnut Hill Community Church, will be joining us right here on this studio tonight. So if you have some questions you've always wondered, it doesn't matter. You can call in. Our phone number is 438-2003. You can call in tonight and ask whatever questions you want. So stay tuned because we have Clive Calver coming up. And as we speak, he's on his way here, and he'll be here in just a minute. But before we get to the kingdom of heaven, we got to deal with the kingdom of this earth. And to do that, we have David Straight of Straight Talk. That's kind of the newsletter that goes out there. Investment dude extraordinaire. Paul, what's the guy who's running for president?
Ron Paul.
Ron Paul, extraordinaire. He's hanging in there. He's hanging in there. An all-around great guy. And we're talking a little bit. There's some issues that are going on in the news right now that you wanted to
the first
bust a rhyme about.
We have to lead in with what's going on with the Supreme Courts in the last week and the Obamacare situation. By the way, the latest statistic is that will add $17 trillion to the deficit, and that the original Congressional Budget Office plugged it in. It's going to add about $800 billion over 10 years. Well, it's actually $2 trillion over 10 years. That's before it even gets started. Yeah. So you do the simple math and you say, you know what, we're plugging in an extra 10 million people, 10 to 15 million people that are going to be getting health care. Yeah. We're not adding any doctors. The average age of doctors in America is 55. Yeah. How are costs not going to explode? But that's one piece of it. Anyway, so the president gives a little off-the-cuff remarks a couple days ago, and he says, I would caution the Supreme Court to realize that they are an unelected body, which, well, way to go, genius. I mean, that's the whole goal of the Supreme Court, is to be unelected so they don't have to cater to people and they can focus on the...
By the way, a little 30-second civics lesson. Yeah. For those of you youngsters tuning in to the Marty Heiser program here, there are 3 branches of government. There's the judiciary, which is, think, Supreme Court and all the courts. There's the executive branch. That would be the president. And then there's the legislative branch. Now, the Democratic senator from New York, Chucky Schumer, would say that the 3 branches of government are the Congress, the Senate, and the executive branch. He, like often you'll find with liberals, they're not quite the sharpest knife in the drawer all the time, although they think they are. Just look at the lawyers that pleaded the case in front of the Supreme Court on Obamacare. Compare and contrast the conservative Republican lawyers and those lawyers from the liberal side, Columbia trained and what have you, left a little bit to be desired. But basically, the judicial branch is allowed to adjudicate on laws whether they conform to the United States Constitution, which is the abiding doctrine of our country, what our country was founded on.
So imagine if the Supreme Court had to get elected. How do you think they'd be ruling, right? So they're supposed to be independent. So that's the goal. So the president stands up and says...
A lifetime position, that's part of not having to be subject to the winds of politics.
Right, so the president stands up and he says, I would like to remind the unelected body of the Supreme Court that by overturning the Obamacare program, that is judicial activism, and that's something the people on the right always protest and contest.
Right, which is true.
False. 100% fault. Nothing could be more wrong. Now, this is supposed to be a scholar, right?
Okay, okay.
Judicial activism is when the courts legislate from the bench, when they make laws.
Okay.
It's not when they overturn them. Their purpose, their role is to determine whether it's constitutional or not. So it's not judicial activism. So either one, he doesn't have any idea what the Constitution's about.
Hold that thought for one second.
Here we go.
Dr. Reverend Clive Calver, are you there?
Yes, indeed, Marty.
And are you in the parking lot right now? Because we need to have someone get out there and let you in the door, right?
No, I'm at a place called Suds and Duds.
Suds and Duds, okay.
You're close.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is live television. If we could have someone go out to the parking lot, because he's down at the laundromat, Dr. Reverend Clive Calver, continue to move towards the railroad tracks and look for my yellow Jeep. We'll see you on. We're live on TV right now. We'll see you shortly. But someone's got to get out in the parking lot to get Reverend Dr. Clive Calver. Hang in there, Dr. Calver. Okay.
So in plain and simple terms, it is not judicial activism. And for the president to threaten the Supreme Court like that is almost unprecedented.
Right.
So anyway, you kind of get a hint. Like last Friday, the Supremes were supposed to meet and give a up or down vote on this, and you almost get the idea that he got a hint that it wasn't going his way, and he has this nasty side to him. That's the whole Chicago political machine, and he's taking a swipe at the Supreme Court. It's not going to serve him well, I'll tell you that. And listen,
what's even more, if you could take that outside and just go to the parking lot.
Either he is nothing close to a scholar on the Constitution, or he's just plain deceptive.
Right.
You know, either one's not good.
Well, partly of what's been really interesting, if you'll recall, we can go back to a State of the Union address where the Democrats and Republican, the Congress, the Senate, and there's the Supreme Court listed right there. And you'll recall from the bully pulpit, President Obama was lecturing
in the State of the Union
about, I think it was something to do with
it was the super PAC concept.
The super PAC concept, and they said it was wrong, and then one of the justices under his breath had to go, oh no, that's not true, and now the shoe's on the other foot, and he's hoping that same crew that he was browbeating in the State of the Union address, his signature legislative passing of Obamacare is now being held depending on those guys.
So
now hold on, because we could be way too optimistic here, because we could run this tape back after June when that regulation comes on, and if we did that, it could turn out that Obamacare doesn't get overturned, and it's hard to speculate. We are joined now by, speaking of overeducated liberals, Larry Ditkoff, an Ivy League graduate from University of Pennsylvania.
We're outmatched, Larry.
Larry, do you have something to add to the conversation?
Yeah, Marty, I do. First, thanks, as always, for giving me a forum to speak.
What?
Dave,
overeducated liberal, is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, I know.
Marty, the best I could say, as long as I'm not what you are. But, from a political standpoint, I think the issue with this particular case, Obamacare, Dave is making the point about this is not a judicial overreach. I think the fact that the way Scalia comported himself on the bench kind of shows that, at least from his standpoint, it really wasn't a judicial issue with him. I think it's pretty obvious that politically or personally that he just doesn't like the law, and I think that's why the president went out and said, I caution the Supreme Court about not being judicial activism. I think what he's saying is that, in his belief, the underlying motivation for taking the case was really politically motivated as opposed to judicially motivated. But with that being said,
well, he's suggesting that there's politics involved with that.
Excuse me?
He's suggesting that there's politics involved with this.
Well,
imagine that.
I listened to the arguments. I got them, I forget how, but I went to some website and I was able to listen. And people were saying that Ted Borelli, who was the Solicitor General, had done a really, an awful job. David made reference to that as well. But when you hear a guy like Scalia go on about, broccoli,
No, his point was that if you quantify healthcare as trade, and thus Congress has a right to regulate it because everyone needs it, he said everyone needs food, and therefore the Congress can pass a law that says everyone needs to eat broccoli.
Broccoli. I know what I know what he said, but the point being is that, and I think the Solicitor General made it, is that by not having healthcare, just as I have to pay higher insurance rates for uninsured or underinsured motorists.
Right.
People who don't have health care, should they have some sort of catastrophic illness or some sort of cost that they
Larry.
can't handle, that cost is borne by the rest of society.
Larry.
I think that's the point. Yeah, Marty.
A very good friend of yours has just entered the studio, the Dr. Reverend Clive Calver, the senior pastor at Walnut Hill Community Church, and also the author of Dying to Live. So we are going to take a quick turn here from the kingdom of man, the city of man, and move to the city of God. I know it's something that you have a lot of interest in, but can we table this discussion now? Because
Marty, I'll hang up now, and I'll listen to what Clive has to say, and if I desire, I'll give a call back later.
After all, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, are we not all God's children, Larry?
Well, I'll get into that later. How about that?
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Marty.
Pastor, you made it.
Thank you very much.
This is live television, 9 to 10. And we were talking about before the show, and we were saying, okay, you got to come to 5 Shelter Rock Road, and you had it in your navigation system, and it was 5 Shelter Rock Road, but it was one town over.
That's life with navigation systems. We get to depend on them.
I am so glad you made it. And full disclosure, Clive has been the pastor at Walnut Hill Community Church now for 6 years.
7.
7 years. And in that time, I've been twisting your arm to come on the show, and I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Just a couple things. We're going to put up the phone number, 438-2003. If you have some questions, anything related to what we're going to be talking about, related to the existence of God, what does that mean for me? How do you live? I tried God once. I was disappointed by the church. Any question you want, please call in because we will try as best we can. My guest, Dr. Calver, will try to answer some of these questions. And I mentioned before that you have a program called Answers Over Easy, where you take people out to breakfast, and it's no holds barred. They can ask any question they want.
Absolutely right.
All right. Well, first question I have. We have had in this studio, we have had some Olympic-level athletes from Russia. We have had Vietnam veterans that came back from Vietnam and had a very, very difficult time. We've had Harvard and Yale University MBA graduates, and they've all had this common story about coming to a point in their life where they surrendered their life to this person called Jesus Christ, and it's changed their life. The Bible talks about having your house built on the sand or having your house built on the rock. And each one of them, from disparate different backgrounds, have had the same experience, and they've said it's revolutionized their life. My question to you is, what's your story along those lines, and how did you come to that point of decision if you did?
Well, Marty, I was of very similar political convictions with yourself when I was younger.
Okay.
I wanted to change the world. I wanted things to be different.
All right.
But that was at a time when life was a little different. And I looked at life and decided that the way to change the world was radical politics.
Right.
So I became a neo-Marxist, along with most of my generation. And in Europe, with the riots going on in Paris, and street marches in London,
right,
and the Vietnam War in full spate, we all wanted to change the world in one way or another.
Right.
For me, it was radical politics. The only trouble was I couldn't change me. And so I faced that awful contradiction. You want to change the world, you want everything to be different, can't even change yourself.
Right. Now, just to set the tone, because right now you're a distinguished British gentleman, you're well turned out with a tie and short cropped hair. Set the picture for the vast viewing audience of what Clive Calver was on the streets of East London back in circa 1960 sometime? Give us a hairdo first.
Well, it was down there somewhere.
Okay.
And I suppose I was the same as the kids of my generation. And it was the same kind of passion. And depending where you lived in the world, depended which side of the fence you were on, but we all wanted life to be different. For me, as I said, I got the contradiction, and I met a man who told me that what changed his life was Jesus. The trouble was, he and his wife shared their home with any drug addict, anyone who was homeless, anyone who was an alcoholic. And they piled them 6 high in the guest room, in army beds. They would do anything just to try to help. And being a blunt kid from the East End of London, I said, "What have you got?" And this guy says, "Jesus." A couple of weeks later, walking up a side street in the East End of London, I remember saying, "God, if you're there," because I wasn't even sure if he was, "would you forgive me and take my life?" And so he said no, and we got on to living.
Wow.
And most people don't like this because they don't accept that God could ever say no to you. But I was absolutely convinced when I tried to give my life to Jesus Christ, he turned me down.
Wow. That's usually not the narrative. The narrative usually goes, I saw the light and I turned, so continue with the story.
So I lit up another cigarette and kept walking.
Okay.
And nothing had changed. And I remember thinking, why on earth should this God turn me down? I mean, this is not right. And the competitive part of me decided I would take God on, and so I tried again. God, if you're there, would you forgive me? Take my life and live inside me. And I still didn't get a lightning flash, but something started to shift. And 6 months later, I was in seminary, and the rest is history. But for me, what changed my life was a God who said to me, if you mean that, it's going to cost you more than you think. And my problem with Christianity is it's so wet, it's so weak, it's so polished, it's so smooth, and it's lost the guts and the grit that a man from Nazareth had when he walked by Galilee. And if we got it back, things might be different.
Wow. Yeah, and that sort of brings us to the book you wrote. The book is called Dying to Live. And basically, give us the preface of the book. What is the theme of the book, and what are you basically? I have a list of questions talking about the emptiness sometimes of the Christian life, the purpose of life begins with the cross, and you sort of speak out against easy believism. But what are you talking about when you say, and it's counterintuitive, dying to live? What are you getting at?
Well, I'm really trying to say that Christianity is a lousy religion.
Okay.
And that if you want
Not what we expected to hear from the pastor of a fast-growing church in Bethel, Connecticut, but okay.
Well, if you want a good religion, I'd try Islam, actually. It's probably the most easily defined. Buddhism or Judaism. I think that the reality is that a religion tells you about God and tells you about yourself, and tells you what you've got to do and the stuff you need to do for this God. Christianity is lousy at those definitions. It doesn't tell you which direction to pray in. It doesn't tell you what God expects of you. So many of us in our churches write out the lists for him and hope he's going to be happy. And I don't believe that Christianity was ever intended to be a religion about God. I believe it was intended to be a relationship with him. But if it was a relationship with him, that's got to be based on life, not death.
Amen.
And maybe Jesus is having to do too much of the dying while we're doing all the living. Maybe he wants us to do some of the dying while he does some of the living. Maybe instead of living for him, he wants to live in us and through us. And so the premise of Dying to Live, which is, I think, number 21 in the books I've inflicted on an unsuspecting public over the years. But the premise of Dying to Live is that if you died and got out of the way, God could do some living. Not physically die, because actually, Marty, I don't think you're ever going to die.
Really?
Well, Scripture says that those who know Jesus have eternal life. Well, if you've got eternal life, how can you die? And if you can't die, what happens when you stop breathing? You just get relocated. And so the beauty of Christianity is it's a relationship with God. The joy of it is it offers you eternal life. The fact of it is it's not about the stuff you do for God, it's about what he does in you and through you. And therefore, it's another whole world removed from any other faith.
If you have any questions, the phone number is on your screen right there, 438-2003. Please don't hesitate to call in. Clive's going to be on for the whole hour. We got Dave Straight out of here, you know, all that political stuff. Which, by the way, yeah, Dave Straight, rumor has it he's still in the studio. But don't hesitate to call in. Again, the number is 438-2003. If some of this is striking a chord, or if you think some of this is so off the wall and you disagree, don't hesitate to call in. Well, what you're saying is very interesting. I mean, I think, when you say Christianity really isn't the best religion, that Islam and Judaism will give you a much better structure to live by, but you've committed your life to sharing the good news of the gospel, but it sounds like you're saying that this is more a relationship than it is just following these lists of do's and don'ts.
Absolutely. I don't believe that real living faith was ever meant to be a list of do's and don'ts. There's nothing radical in what I'm saying. This is traditional evangelical Christian faith. This is how it's always been. If you go back to John Wesley, this is the message you'll get. If you go to John Bunyan with Pilgrim's Progress, this is the message you'll get. If you go to the Apostle Paul, this is the message you'll get. It's the message of Augustine. It's the message that has gone through the church. We've thrown it away by this passion for baptizing our culture. We live in a world where we want to know what we can do, what we can't do, and if we do what we should do, then we're going to get to heaven. I don't read that in the Bible. I read if you know Jesus, you spend eternity with him. If you're separated from Jesus, you spend eternity without him. It's not about what you do, it's all about who you know. It's all about knowing the one who died for you. It's not about what you do for him, it's about what he does for you. And that's not new Christianity. It's the same old faith that's always been there. We've just mislaid it somewhere.
Do you think that there are a number of people out there that are kind of walking around and they say, well, am I Christian? They'll say, well, yes, I'm a Methodist. Or, you know, I was raised in the Congregational Church. I went to First Holy Communion in the Catholic Church. So, of course, I'm a Christian. But really, there's more to it. There's coming to this point of surrender. There's coming to this point of dying so that you might live. Talk a little bit about that.
Marty, are you excited about your relationship with Jesus? Do you wake up in the morning and you're just thrilled that God is inhabiting your life? Are you absolutely turned on when you're going to worship him and spend time with him? Because if you are, I don't care if you're a Methodist, Baptist, or anything else. It really doesn't matter. What matters is, do you know Jesus? Yeah. Is he living in you? And the whole reality of what this faith is that once upon a time, God took a people called the Jews, and he made them his special people. And he revealed himself to them. He revealed himself to them in creation, in conscience, within the whole priestly system they had. And they didn't get it. And so he sends his son as the Messiah to show them a person. God never yelled from heaven, Marty Heiser, come in number 9, all is required of you. Yeah. What he did was he offered you his son and life and a relationship. And I think that's what makes Christianity so incredible. It's not the rules and regulations, it's the reality of knowing Jesus, and of knowing the very God who made you, brought this world into being. And so you start from a Jewish background, Catholic background, Anglican background, Baptist background, anything. The question isn't, how were you brought up? The question isn't, how are you trying to live? The question is, how much do you love Jesus? And how real is he to you?
Well, the truth be known, and if nothing else here on the show, we try to be as transparent as possible. I have had that experience. I was raised in the Catholic faith, and I got nothing bad to say about the Catholic faith. I think they do a lot of good work. In a lot of ways, I think they put the rest of us to shame on the right to life, and taking a stand for life, and taking a stand for traditional marriage, and a lot of other things. Totally. As a matter of fact, I had the pleasure of meeting then Bishop Dolan, who's now Cardinal Dolan, and he's a pretty impressive guy. But yeah, I had the same situation. It was sometime during my high school years that I was raised Catholic, so I figured everything with God and I were fine. You know, I wasn't. Not only was I a Christian, I was a Catholic. That's like the big leagues, you know. And but I went on this ski trip with an organization called Young Life. They've actually been on the show before, and that's where I first learned this message that you're talking about. That Christianity is not just a list of do's and don'ts, but it's actually an active relationship with Christ. And it was at some point during my freshman year of high school that in my own feeble sort of way I made that decision. The Bible talks about in Revelations 3:20, it says, Behold, I stand at your heart's door and knock. And any man who hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and dine with him and he with me. And I did make that decision. Now, it hasn't meant that my life has been carefree, and I want to get to this because on page 11 in your book, you talk about the Christian life as the glorious roller coaster ride of the life of the Spirit, and I want to get to that. But before we do, we have a caller calling in. And by the way, the phone number here is 438-2003. If you have any questions for Dr. Reverend Clive Calver, anything that you've been wondering, I don't think it's an accident you're watching this show right now, but don't hesitate to call because we always like getting calls. Yes, caller, you're on the air. Do you have a question for Clive?
Yes, I do, Marty. Thank you. First, Clive, this is Larry Didkoff. First, let me take a moment to wish you a happy Easter a couple of days early. And let me also tell you that I enjoyed the book. I also enjoyed Vicky's book, Illusions of Grandeur, very much.
The newly engaged Vicky Calver, but that's a whole nother show. I'd like to get the guy on because she's gone ahead with this without checking with me. But I'm sure it'll all work out.
Marty, she did check with me.
Oh, she did check with you, and you gave him the, okay. Okay, go ahead. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Here's my question. You made the point previously that Christianity isn't about do's and don'ts. I grew up in a very secular household, and I really had no religious training or really any religious interest whatsoever until I read Marty, until I met Marty, excuse me. And as I've gone through the Bible and I do Torah study, when you read the Old Testament, the Father, or God, he's pretty clear about types of offerings you should make when you commit sins. It's very specific. About circumcising the male young, observance of certain holidays, the observance of the Sabbath. And he also says that, I've given you my commandments. He says this to Moses, at the end of his life. I've given you my commandments. You'll obey them. You'll add nothing to them. You'll subtract nothing from them.
Okay. Larry, you gotta land this plane. You gotta give us a question.
Okay, but my point is, given that the Father laid down these rules, and then Jesus comes along and says, well, it's not that which goes into you which defiles you, it's that which comes out of you. Yet the Father said, well, eating non-kosher food is an abomination. It's okay to work on the Sabbath. The Father said to Moses, well, if you work on the Sabbath, you can be killed. And all these offerings that are required, as opposed to saying... So
your point is that the God of the...
My point is, it seems that Jesus, by definition, would be in contradiction.
Okay.
And these do's and don'ts are what matter.
Okay. All right, hold on. By the way, did the Mets win today?
Mets won 1-0. Santana threw a shutout.
There you go.
And then, yep, okay.
How can you not believe in a loving God when you see something like that the Mets won? All right, Larry, I'm sort of kidding. It is a miracle. I think we can all agree on that. All right, thanks a lot. Thanks for the call. What about that? His point seems to be that there was a God of the Old Testament who did set up rules and regulations and was kind of a heavy-handed, angry dude. And then you have Jesus that comes along in the New Testament and says, come on, boys will be boys, don't worry about that. Or that's what he seems to be indicating. How do you respond to that?
Yes, I agree.
Well, that's good. That's all for today, and thanks for joining us on the Marty Heiser Show. No, I'm just kidding. Come on, give me more than that you agree with Larry, because that scares me, frankly.
Well, I do agree with Larry. If you're going to look at things straightforwardly, that's exactly what you've got. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the logic is that because Jesus came and rocked the boat and turned the apple cart over and everything else, that logically the religious leaders of the day will try and kill him for it. Coincidentally, they did, and they succeeded. The whole reality of it is that Jesus is against the old order. That God created an old order, and people would not conform to it. The Jews would not live as God wanted them to live. And so recognizing that, in the end, as a last resort, God sends his Son to no longer have a people under instruction, but to have a people who could receive his power, his life, and his love. I don't think I have to do anything for God. I just think I have to let God do everything through me. And that's the difference between the Old Covenant, as we call the Jewish relationship, and the New Covenant. The Old Covenant is about God's people doing what would please him, or not doing what would please him. The New Covenant is about God's recognition that people just screw up and fail. So if they're not going to do it right, he's going to come and do it for them and through them. And that's where you get some incredible words like grace, where God's love meets you despite the lousy, horrible person that you are. He still loves you. And despite the wreck you make of your life, he comes and he reaches you. And despite everything about you, he comes and gives you what you can't give yourself. And that's the difference between the two. One is God saying how we should live, and he's right, but we fail. The other is God saying, well, if you're not going to live that way, I'm going to give you the power to live that way. And so coming through his Son, giving us forgiveness, and then with his Spirit, giving us the power to live. And that's a great story.
It really is. I mean, when you look at it, the strictures laid down in the Old Testament, the 10 Commandments, as a matter of fact, Jesus sort of doubled down on the 10 Commandments. You know, in the Sermon on the Mount, it said, you were told, it was said, you should not commit adultery. But he took it one step further and said, even if you look on a woman, it's like you committed adultery. In the Old Testament, it said, you should not commit murder. But he doubles down on that and says, even if you're angry with your brother, it's as if you committed murder. But then at the same time, he comes with this message of grace, saying that I will take upon me the sins of the world. And we see that right now. We're tomorrow is going to be Good Friday, and we see that passion played out where Christ took on the sins of the world. And then a later verse says, for by grace are you saved through faith. It's not of yourself, not a result of works, lest any man should boast. None of us can go and say, look, I helped out at the soup kitchen, I was a pretty good father, I loved my wife, so I deserve heaven. That's not what the Bible says. It says not as a result of works, but it's a gift of God. And all we need to do is receive that gift. I mean, it's an incredible story, and it's kind of fortuitous that you're here right on the eve of Easter and Good Friday and what's going on right now, because that's integral to the message of the gospel, that indeed Jesus had to die so that we might have life.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems is that people automatically think that Jesus was against the Jewish law. He said, I've come to fulfill it. Yeah. Recognizing you can't do it, I'm going to come and do it through you. And then people say, well, Christianity is an easy cop-out. You don't have to do anything. And you don't have to do anything to be a Christian. You just have to die. Yeah. And people say, well, hang on, isn't suicide a mortal sin? Well, firstly, I don't believe suicide is a mortal sin. I believe it's a misuse and abuse, and therefore it is a sin. But I've got a God who can forgive all sin. And if we confess our sin, he's faithful and just and will forgive us our sin and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And God doesn't want you to go and commit suicide. God wants you to die to yourself. In other words, he wants you to die to your way of life, to what you would do, to what you think is best. And so Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, it's Christ who lives in me. So the message of Good Friday isn't just that Jesus died, but he wants you to die as well. To die to your ambition, to die to yourself, to die to your own way of doing it. And there's something wonderful about that, because after it, there comes, that was Friday. You then get Sunday, and the tomb's empty and Jesus is alive. And we're going to be baptizing people at Walnut Hill on Sunday. And they're going to go right under the water to say, I'm dying to my old life with Jesus. And then they're going to come out again, providing I can pull them up, and they're going to come out again, and they're going to say, I'm going to live a new life with Jesus. And that's the incredible truth of it, that life will never, ever be the same after you've surrendered that life to Jesus. And people tell me that Christianity is supposed to be easy, restful, lovely, I'll have health, and prosperity and everything will be nice. You're watching the wrong TV programs. It's not like that.
Yeah.
My problems began when I became a Christian. But I will tell you something. Others will then say, well, it's boring and it's dreadful and it's all pain. The incredible thing about Christianity is Jesus wants you to surrender to him. But then the reality is that the living God never leaves you. And so you've got a God who makes demands from you, but he's with you right in the middle of everything. He didn't promise you a get-out-of-jail-free card, but he promised that you'd never go through anything without him. Hey, imagine that. You can have God walking with you, God living in you, God transforming your life, God blessing you and being with you. And that's the crucified life.
Okay, so wait a second. Let me make sure I got this straight. So if I come to this point of surrender and I turn my life over to the Lord, I say, look, I've kind of made a mess of things. I happen to be watching this cable TV show, and there's this guy with a wonderful blue tie on, and he said that, you know, God died for my sins and I can turn my life over to him. Are you telling us that if you do that, we're not going to have comfort and security and leisure and, dare I say, riches, you know, that God promised, like you see on, you know, some of these other programs that you see on TV? Is that not the case?
I think that the reality is that I probably ought to say no. Now, God might give you comfort, leisure, money, and everything else. God might not. I was bumping my way in a truck in Ethiopia. And back in those days, I was the president of World Relief, the Relief and Development Agency. And I was trying to find church in this particular part of southern Ethiopia. Major famine. We really wanted to supply support for the churches. And I got to this village, didn't know where I was going to find church. There was no evidence of a church building. But there was this gorgeous African lady with two little children playing by her feet. So I went up to her and said, you know, who are you? And she said, oh, I'm no one, but my husband's the pastor. So I thought, great, I found church. I said, where is he? She said, oh, he's not here. He's in the next village preaching Jesus. I said, great. How long have you been here? She said, oh, we've been here in the village a year. I said, great, what happened to your predecessor? She said, they killed him. I said, okay, who killed him? She said, oh, the villagers. I said, why did they kill him? She said, well, he came preaching this strange God, this Jesus, and the rain stopped. So they killed him for stopping the rain. Nobody sent food, nobody helped, so they got rid of him. I said, okay. So why did you and your husband come with the two little children? An African lady has the capacity of looking at you, Marty, and giving you a look that kind of says, you silly white boy. You stupid Mzungu. You don't get it. And it's the look of a real wise woman. And this young lady was years younger than me, but she gave me one of those looks. You silly man. I said, well, why did you come? She said, we're Christians. As if that explained everything. She said, this is what Christians do, isn't it? And the reality is that when you give your life to Jesus, you can't make any conditions. You can't say you can have my life if I'm going to marry Billy. You can't say you can have my life if I'm going to be wealthy, if I'm going to do well in the market, if I'm always going to get the bonuses. You can't say you're going to have my life providing you never send me to Africa. You can't say you can have my life because I'm going to go to Africa and you're going to bless me. All of that's off. All deals are gone. You give your life to the one who loves you and he's going to give you what he wants for you. Now, I wanted to go into politics and I ended up a pastor. It's amazing what God will do. The one thing I guarantee you is, whatever he does with your life, he'll be there. It'll be way better than anything else you'd have ever had. And you will know the reality of knowing, loving, and living for God, and then having eternity with him. You just can't lose.
Yeah, I once heard that God is more interested in your preoccupation than your occupation. And now in the book you talk a little bit about that, because you talk about coming to this point of decision, surrendering your life to Christ, and then going even one step further and just completely giving it all to the Lord and just trusting in him. And that sometimes Christians, even in the church, they've got maybe their life insurance, but they're kind of, well, you call it easy believerism. And what you're proposing is, you described it as a glorious roller coaster ride of life in the Spirit. And you talk about how even though when you become a Christian, you surrendered your life to Christ, but crucifixion precedes the resurrection. That you need to surrender to your life to Christ. And that Christianity is not a religion about God, but it's a relationship with God. And you talk a lot about risk-taking for Christ. What do you mean by that?
Well, I believe that everything about knowing and loving Jesus is taking a risk. It's trusting the God who made you, the God who loves you, to actually walk with you and be with you. It's the intimacy of a personal relationship. When you're in a relationship with someone, you take risks in that relationship. When you're seeking to do something to please someone, you take risks. Mm-hmm. And the idea that Christianity is a nice, safe, sit-on-your-fat evangelical backside option has never quite appealed to me or struck me as being real. And
see, a little bit of that long-haired hippie storming the U.S. Embassy on the streets of London back in the 60s, some of that revolutionary spirit seems to have spilled over into your Christian life.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I've had the joy of preaching in churches like Westminster Cathedral, the Catholic Cathedral in London, or in St. Paul's or Westminster Abbey, and knowing that, you know, even long-haired hippies can be changed by Jesus and used by him. I don't think God necessarily makes you safe and secure. He just makes his relationship real with you. There was this old guy who was just a real sort of, you know, street guy, a tramp, you might call him if you wanted to be unfair. Just a genuine guy who was down on his luck at the time. And he walked into a church one day at 12 o'clock. And the vicar, the priest, saw him and watched carefully, because the old man did not look very credible or upright or reliable. But a minute later, the man comes out again. The next day, the clergyman just happens to be outside the church again. And there's the same old guy. Walks into church, walks out again a minute later. The clergyman's looking, what is this? And every day, this old guy walks in, a minute later, walks out. In the end, the clergyman goes up to him and says, I'm sorry, but I have a personal policy that this church should be open to everybody, but it has lots of valuable things in it, and I do have a responsibility. Do you mind me asking, why do you come into the church every day at 12 o'clock and come out a minute later? Are you scoping it out, or what are you doing?
Yeah.
He said, the old boy said, I don't know much. So I just goes in there and I thinks to myself, I want to pray. So I just sits down for a minute and I says, Jesus, it's Jim. I ain't got much education, that's all I knows. So I just says, Jesus, it's Jim. And I figures if he's there, he's going to hear me. One day, the clergyman was outside and Jim didn't turn up. And the next day, 12 o'clock, the bells rang and he didn't turn up. And the next day he didn't turn up. So the clergyman starts looking for Jim. He'd got used to talking to the old boy, and he found him in hospital. And so he asked if he could see Jim, and when he went to see him, he said, Jim, it's so nice to see you. Jim was thrilled to see the clergyman and said, oh, it's lovely to see you. And the clergyman said, are you all right, Jim? Is it okay? And Jim said, oh, it's great. It's lovely in here. This nurse really looks after me well. And, of course, there's my visitor every day, which just makes it wonderful. And the nurse looks at the clergyman much as to say, well, no, he's going soon. And obviously his mind's wandering. And Jim catches the look and says, no, I have a visitor every day. He comes every day at 12. And all he does is he stands at the foot of the bed and he says, Jim, it's Jesus. It's not about being destroyed. It's not about being made into some plastic, grinning caricature of a Christian. It's about being a real person with a real love and a real life who finds in Jesus the fulfillment of that. You don't stop being a Red Sox fan or a Yankees fan. You don't stop being a committed Republican or Democrat or whatever. You don't get your life sort of twisted up. You just get Jesus coming and teaching you how to live with him. And the maker of heaven and earth comes and makes his home inside you and comes and says, Marty, it's Jesus.
Yeah, you know, sometimes I think that's one of the common misconceptions that you see in popular culture. Like on Saturday Night Live, they had that person of the church lady, you know, and she was sort of very uptight. Or even on the cartoon, The Simpsons, they'll have that Ned Flander. He's got the mustache, and he's the Christian guy next door with the Christian fish. And I mean, when I look at Christians, I see people like Jesus said, I came that you might have life and you might have it more abundantly. And I see people that are living their lives. Are they perfect? No. Do they have passions? Did they get it wrong? No. But they are forgiven, and they do know, they may not know what the future holds, but they do know who holds the future. And when you go through something like the economic crisis we've just been through now, hopefully the worst is behind us the last few years, it's those that have given their life to Christ and have that foundation, like it talks about, where you build your life on the rock, not the shifting sands. And then when the storm comes, it's not if the storm comes, it's when the storm comes. If you have that firm foundation, I think that's one of the benefits. You talk a little bit too, talking about Christian life as an adventure. You talk in your book, it's just describing, I guess it was A.W. Tozer talking about with wonderful clarity the church began in power, and you describe it as these men and women, these are men and women in the church living their life for Christ. These men and women are comfortable out on a limb in the power of the Lord, and they are turning their world upside down. And doesn't it seem strange that so many Christians cling to the safety when risky living should be the order of the day? Why are so many of us more easily identified with respectability than with what you would term healthy extremism? What do you mean by that? And what do you mean about being comfortable out on a limb? It doesn't sound like the sort of subdued Christian church that you see in popular culture.
Well, I don't think we should be living like that. I mean, you know that at Walnut Hill we have our own brothels. And I personally think that's an excellent way for a church to operate.
My wife and I started coming to Walnut Hill Community Church in Bethel, Connecticut. There's also churches in Seymour in the Valley, which this show appears on, and also up in New Milford, in Litchfield County, where this show also appears. So just go to walnuthill.com or Google Walnut Hill. You'll see a lot of that. But when my wife and I first stepped into the church, I believe you were reporting from Bangladesh, and your comment was, if I could just get the women of the church to allow their husbands to buy a prostitute for $100, I think we could really do something here with this brothel. But just so we don't have a bad reputation, why don't you explain what happened with this brothel?
There's a lot
Talk about living on the edge and healthy extremism. Go ahead.
There's a lot of talk nowadays about child prostitution. There's a lot of talk about what we should be doing. There's a lot of talk about how we can protest. I don't want to protest. I don't want to make a noise. I want to see people's lives changed. I used to be the president of World Relief. I had 20,000 staff around the world working in their countries to try and see people's lives changed. In a country like Bangladesh, the churches are desperately wanting to do something. All we did in the first one was we took a brothel of 294 prostitutes, and we gave the girls the chance to come out of prostitution. We gave them the opportunity to get job training for new careers. We gave them the chance to have a home and for the churches to build a home for them. There were 198 children who at 8 would have been taken into prostitution. We gave the kids a chance to get into Christian education and to be given a roof over their heads and a future. And every 2 or 3 months we hear the latest batch of 25 prostitutes. Normally, do they all come out? No. We get about 23, 24, of whom 4 or 5 by then will be married. The others will have jobs, they'll be in professions. Their kids will be growing in the love and knowledge of God and having a future ahead of them. And all because a respectable church was prepared to lose its respectability and not do anything immoral in the slightest but just simply provide a new way of life for people who often Christians would have nothing to do with. We were simply supporting the churches in Bangladesh to change the lives of people who are right out on a limb, because my Jesus would have done that. Those are the kind of people he mixed with. We're not doing anything extreme, just normal Christian living.
I'm telling you, when you do look at the life of Jesus, talk about not being extreme, but certainly Jesus did not fit the cookie cutter vision of what a Christian might be, a little bit uptight and by the rules. In the New Testament, you see Jesus hanging out at parties with the tax gatherers and the sinners. It was the religious leaders of the day that sort of turned up their nose at him and says, how can he associate with those people?
Right.
Look, he's hanging out with, with the prostitutes and so forth. So I think sometimes Christianity gets a bad image in that, while you become, self-righteous or something like that. I think it's quite the opposite. As you say in your book, Dying to Live, you have to come to a point where you've given your life over completely, and that's when that living the abundant life, that adventure that you were meant to be, really begins to come through.
I'm sometimes asked, what would I like on my tombstone when I die? And I know what I'd like, but I've not lived up to it, so I'll never get it. What I would love to have is for someone to carve, he lived as one of the Parabolani. And Parabolani...
Flesh that out for us, Pastor.
Parabolani is an odd word. In the early days of the church, around the year 250 AD, a man named Cyprian was bishop in Carthage, and they had one of the two great plagues in the Roman Empire that were the two times the churches grew most. What happened was that Cyprian sent his best, his young men and young women, into the plague areas to live, caring for the sick, nursing the sick, and helping the dying. They died by the score, but they got so fed up with what they were seeing that they would put their mouths down over the suppurating sores of the plague victims and suck out the poison in the name of Jesus. And they really did die. I mean, the incredible thing about that was they became known as the Parabolani, those who drew near and walked with them. These young men and women showed Carthage what a real Christian is. The reality is that Carthage never had the same view of church again, because church is not people who are the nice ones, the respectable ones, going through the motions. Church is full of people, ordinary people like you and I, who've messed up, screwed up, and got it wrong. But we've surrendered our lives to Jesus. He's forgiven us. He's come to our lives, given us a fresh start, and now we're out on a limb by God's grace, changing a little bit of our world for Jesus.
Like the bumper sticker says, Christians aren't any better, they're just forgiven. And I think that's the difference. You talk towards the end of the book, sort of a how then shall we live, or you make the, you say, God can only use us if we have been broken. And you talk about the value of brokenness, but then you go on to say, don't waste your life. And you talk about how people that are living their life for Christ are right up on the front lines. You said, take it from me, or take me to the front lines of the work of the kingdom. And it talks about how we're not supposed to waste our life, like in Matthew 25 with the talents. It says, I long with all my heart to be part of a church that gets Jesus standing because we lived and died for him, did not waste our lives sitting back and comfortably anticipating heaven. Instead, we allowed him to live through us and love through us and touch and change this world. That seems to be the point of what you're talking about in this dying to live. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I believe that's absolutely crucial. There was a young student in Britain who was offered a night at a big London concert hall by an impresario. The impresario filled the concert hall with people. The young man was allowed to play that night, and he played Bach, and he played out of his skin. And when he finished, the British forgot they were British. They stood.
Oh my.
They clapped. They cheered. Some even stamped their feet.
Oh my.
And the amazing thing was, the impresario ran round the back, and he said to the young man, go and play an encore. And the young man said, no. The impresario said, they're all standing for you. The young man said, no, they're not. Up in the balcony, that old man's sitting. Oh, he doesn't know his music, said the impresario. Oh, yes, he does, said the young student. That's my teacher. If he was standing and everyone else was sitting, I'd play an encore. he's sitting, no encore. 2,000 years ago, a man named Stephen died. He was stoned to death, and his face shone as he saw his Jesus waiting for him. And Scripture doesn't say that he saw the Jesus who's seated at the right hand of his Father waiting for Stephen. Scripture says Stephen saw Jesus standing, waiting for him. And I want to live a life, and I want to be part of a church that lives a life, and I want to be part of a community that lives a life in such a way that Jesus is standing when we eventually go home to be with him. That Jesus is standing because of how we lived and how we died, loving him and knowing him. And I believe you can live your life and you can do your best and you can be as commendable as you can, or I believe you can surrender that life to Jesus, and with the power of God within you, one day he may be standing to welcome you home.
Wow. Rick Warren wrote a book called The Purpose-Driven Life. I think they've sold 30 million copies or something like that. It was a bestseller. I think people bought that book, and it was such a bestseller because they're trying to answer the question, what really is it all about? Why am I here? Why was I put on this earth? And especially when you look at what's just happened in the economy, you know, is it the idea that we just want to go to a good college, get a good job so we can buy that house in the suburbs and have security and plan for the future? Well, sometimes that just gets swept away. I mean, we've known people that have lost their jobs, lost everything, had to move, and that's not what you can base your life on. But what Clive Calver talks about in his book, Dying to Live, is this concept of surrendering your life to Christ. And if you haven't heard anything else as we've talked about tonight, we don't want you to necessarily go out and buy this book, although it's a good book, but this is non-commercial public access television, so we're not telling you to buy anything, but you can Google it and it's a great book. We're not telling you that the best thing to do is for you to go to Walnut Hill Community Church and attend that church, although it's a great church and there's 5 other satellite churches. But what we are saying is that it's probably not an accident that you somehow turned into this weird, quirky little cable TV show tonight, and consider, if you would, having a relationship with Jesus Christ, coming to a point where you're willing to die so that you can live. If you want to get in touch with Clive Calver, just Google Walnut Hill Community Church, and you'll have a bunch of resources on that. Walnut Hill Community Church. Clive, I want to thank you so much for finding the studio, coming to 5 Shelter Rock Road in Danbury, not Bethel, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot. Now join us next week. We are going to have a rerun of actually a sad story, but with hopefully a happy ending. Wilton resident died in Iraq. Nick Madera. We're going to have a rerun of that show, and then following that, we have a whole parade of politicians. We'll get right back into the city of God, or right back into the city of man after spending some time in the city of God. But thanks for joining us, the Marty Heiser Show, where you always get the truth, and join us again next Thursday night. Good job, Mets. You're in first place. Gotta love it. See you next week. Thank you.